America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. Welcome to our special right here on the First TV. Who is Tim Walz? Trump dodged another bullet. No question about it. There couldn't have been a better pick if you're Trump's team, of course. If you support Donald Trump, there couldn't have been a better pick from Kamala than Tim Walz for VP. It just doubles down on her progressivism. Tim Walz, and I'll prove this here in a second, we'll fill in the gaps. Tim Walz wants to California, Minnesota, and Kamala wants to California, America. Would I call on my radio show compare Walz with Gavin Newsom? You could argue that Walz is worse because Gavin Newsom is in California, which has been for a long time now super progressive, so he's being progressive in a progressive place. Tim Walz is taking not Minnesota values and turning Minnesota into California. Top 3 points about Tim Walz. First, right out of the gate, Tampon Tim. We'll explain that in a minute. Sanctuary state. He wants to make Minnesota a sanctuary. He has indeed passed bills that make Minnesota a sanctuary state for transgender kids. Talk more about that in a minute. And driver's licenses for illegal aliens. What are we talking about? Sprinkle in some George Floyd cult, watch his city burn, and you got Tim Walz. And Kamala looked at that whole package and said, yes, that's my guy. That's who I need. Now, before we go into the details about Tim Walz, I think the biggest story about all this is who she did not choose. And that's the governor of Pennsylvania. And she did not choose him because he's Jewish. This is not me. This is not a right-wing attack. Here's Van Jones saying the exact same thing.
The conservatives, the right wing, the Republicans, they were chewing their fingernails down to the knuckle because they were afraid of a Josh Shapiro. They were afraid of a Mark Kelly. They're not as afraid of this new governor because they think they can define him. So here's the challenge you've got in this party. People don't want to talk about it. We got to talk about it. On the one hand, you have a lot of young people who are concerned about Gaza. You have a lot of Muslims and Arabs and others. They have not felt seen by the Biden administration. You start hearing that genocide joke. That was building. And so those folks needed to have a candidate that they could feel comfortable with. This helps them in that regard. But you also have anti-Semitism that has gotten marbled into this party. You can be for the Palestinians without being an anti-Jewish bigot, but there are some anti-Jewish bigots out there. And there's some disquiet now, and there has to be. How much of what just happened is caving into some of these darker parts in the party?
Yes, absolutely. I was talking to Mike Rogers the other day. He's running for Senate in Michigan as a Republican. He said there's 300,000 Muslims in Michigan who are registered to vote. Biden won Michigan by 150,000 votes in 2020. Trump won Michigan by only 11,000 votes in 2026. So if the Democrats take off half of the Muslims, again, there's 300,000 of them. If Democrats take off half of them, then it's over. If they take off 10% of them, then that even makes a huge difference. You throw in there, Josh Shapiro the other day tweeted, trans women are women, so the dude can go into your daughter's locker room, that's a big deal. But the fact that there's that it's such a big, that the Hamas wing of the Democratic Party is such a big part of the Democratic Party that it must be pandered to. That's the story. Does that make sense? Like, it's one thing to be like, oh, we got a couple of anti-Semites here, and there's some people who like Hamas, but whatever, let's ignore them. No. It's, wow, a large portion of our party is pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic. There's such a big major part, we cannot pick the obvious guy that we should pick for our vice president that would help us win Pennsylvania. Instead, we'll go with Tim Walz. That's the story. So why did she pick him? Tim Walz has a pretty good folksy sounding chic Midwest kind of vibe thing that he can do. It's phony, of course, but they think it will be a good counter to J.D. Vance as the Midwest white guy. It won't work. Rich Lowry put it nicely. He said, Tim Walz is an MSNBC anchor's idea of what a folksy politician is who can appeal to middle America. But to pick Walz and not put Pennsylvania in play is so insane. I can't. I got one last point on this. If she picked Shapiro, she probably would have won Pennsylvania. And you don't know, but it would have helped her a lot, and she would have won Pennsylvania, which means that we could play a little, war gaming here of the election map. If Kamala won Pennsylvania, then Trump will need to win Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and either Michigan or Wisconsin. Okay, that's what if the Democrats won Pennsylvania, then it would be a harder road. Trump would need to flip Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and either Michigan or Wisconsin, either one of those. But now Pennsylvania is back in play, which also means Dave McCormick for Senate is back in play too. So maybe we could pick up a Senate seat from this as well. But if Trump wins Pennsylvania, right? Follow this now. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, which he's more likely to do now with Tim Walz on the ticket, if Trump wins Pennsylvania, all he has to do is flip Georgia, that's it. Pennsylvania and Georgia. If Trump wins Pennsylvania and Georgia, he can lose Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. He can lose all of those. Just got to win Pennsylvania and Georgia. The map is in Trump's favor. Now, there are major election integrity issues with, in particular, those two states, Georgia and Pennsylvania. We will address those. But that aside, those are the two he needs to win. And Kamala just left it open. Okay, let's go into more detail about Walz. Enough of Josh Shapiro, but don't forget that. That's a very important part of the story. Let's talk about Walz for a little bit. First of all, the cover-up. He's as much involved in the cover-up of Joe Biden's failing health as Kamala was. Here's Walz just like July.
Is he fit for office? Do you think he's fit for office?
Yes, fit for office. President has 3.5 years of delivering for us, going through what we've all been through. None of us are denying. Thursday night was a bad performance. It was a bad hit, if you will, on that. But it doesn't impact what I believe. He's delivering.
Okay, so he's on that cover-up. His nickname's Tampon Tim. Why? He signed a bill that requires tampons to be placed in every school bathroom from 4th through 12th grade. You're like, okay, I guess, I don't know, Minnesota, I guess you could do whatever you want. The person who wrote the bill said that the associated cost of the measure is a wise investment because it will keep students from missing school due to what she calls period poverty. And she says 1 out of every 10 menstruating youth miss school during their menstruating cycle due to lack of access to menstrual products and resources. Okay, I don't know if that's true, but whatever. Did you catch the word there? 1 out of 10 what? 1 out of 10 menstruating youth? The story of this bill is that it also requires tampons to be put in all boys' bathrooms. So the Republicans wanted to add an amendment to add the word female to the bill, like only girls' bathrooms, but it failed in committee. Because the person who wrote the bill said not all students who menstruate are female. Now, she did acknowledge that female students use menstruation products more often than boys. More often, but not all. So it's still important to have them in the boys' bathrooms as well. Okay, that's crazy. That's insane. That's wacky, weird. I don't know what adjective you want to say. You're living on a different planet. That story right there, to me, that's all you need to know. We have more, but that's all you need to know. That is a metaphor. It's real. That actually is not a parable. So that actually did happen, that bill I just told you about. But it's also a metaphor for everything. If you're so disconnected from reality that you think we need to put tampons in the boys' bathroom in school, the sky's the limit for whatever. Like there's nothing that is true. I would love for someone to go up to Tim Walz and hand him a tampon and be like, hey, Tim, I have a young son in the 4th grade. I've never personally used one of these, but do you mind showing me how my son could best use this? I'm not sure how it works exactly. But they're so disconnected from reality, it's unbelievable. All right, I think this is the worst one of all, somewhat related. Minnesota is now a sanctuary state for transgender kids. Walz signed a bill protecting transgender kids in the state. Now, by you and I, when I say protecting them, we think that means by banning their sterilization and mutilation. But no, not in our world. Protecting, it means allowing them and giving them surgeries and chemicals and all the rest. Horrible. So that's Minnesota under Walz. He signed that bill. He also signed a bill allowing, again, all wanting to be more like California, a bill that allows illegal aliens to have driver's licenses. Here's a clip of that.
It's done.
A packed room at the St. Paul Armory erupted after the governor's signature made driver's license for all the law of the land.
For all? For all? What do you mean driver? Like who wasn't getting driver's licenses? Were black people not getting driver's licenses? Were they not? Hold on. Before that bill, were black and Hispanic people not allowed to have driver's licenses? Who's the for all that now needs to be? Oh, you mean illegal aliens? It's not driver's license for all. It's driver's license for illegal aliens. See the difference? Amazing. So that's been true in California for a while, and now it's true in Minnesota as well. And Kamala wants to California America. There's no better person than, if that's your goal, to California America, there's no better choice, because Newsom won't do it because he wants to be president one day, so he's not going to be Kamala's vice president. It's ridiculous. So if you want a California America, then of course you're going to go to the next best thing, and that would be Minnesota. So there you have it. To me, those are the big ones, and of course George Floyd on top of that. Tim Walz, again, has this folksy thing that he can do. He could put on a camouflage baseball cap for his staged phone call with Kamala. He's a pretty quick talking guy, more articulate than Kamala, that's for sure. But his policies are just insane. Tim Walz is the governor that Kamala never got to be. Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris, I want to take a break here because we've got some great guests here, but Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris, they both came from the same San Francisco machine, but they went different routes. So Gavin Newsom went mayor of San Francisco, then lieutenant governor and governor, and Kamala went district attorney of San Francisco, then attorney general of the state, and then senator, right? So they went different routes, but they're from the same machine, same time, same everything. So Kamala never got to be governor, right? She just went a different way. She went to be senator, but you can hide when you're a senator, right? You can be like, oh, that wasn't my bill, or I didn't vote for that, or, I got 99 other senators I got to work with, blah, blah, blah. You can hide when you're senator, but you can't when you're governor. You got to sign the bill or not sign the bill. You pass it or veto it. So Kamala can hide as a senator. So we don't know how she would govern. Well, now you do. Now you do. Tim Walz. She would govern as Governor Tim Walz has governed. Governor Kamala would be Governor Walz. And what's her worldview? Well, here's Kamala's advice for all of us.
You know, we have to stay woke. Like, everybody needs to be woke. And you can talk about if you're the wokest or woker, but just stay more woke than less woke. Yeah.
Got some great guests today. Dr. Scott Jensen ran against Tim Walz for governor in just this last election. He'll be a great man to ask, who is this guy? Right here on the First TV.
But we can get out there, reach out, make the case. And for one thing, don't ever shy away from our progressive values. One person's socialism is another person's neighborliness.
Welcome back to our special on Tim Walz. Who is this guy? I don't know if anyone knows him as a candidate better than Dr. Scott Jensen, who ran against him for governor of Minnesota. Dr. Jensen, how are you, sir?
Good, thank you. And thanks for having me on, Mike.
My pleasure. What's the most important thing we need to know about Tim Walz?
I think that he's a Teflon man. I think that if you look at what he's been able to do, when he makes a mistake, he's generally able to sidestep any responsibility. He's very good. He's affable. He bloviates. He talks extemporaneously. But I think at the end of the day, nothing sticks. And in Minnesota, the media has been very friendly to him and willing to sort of let him get off the hook. The news cycles that normally affect Tim Walz that are adverse usually last 2 or 3 days max, and they move on. I think other things, though, that people shouldn't look for a deep-seated set of convictions that are going to drive his decision-making. I think that what they're going to find is more of a zeitgeist kind of approach. What is going on in the moment? What's the feeling of, if you will, the voters today? He's more of a zeitgeist kind of person. He's not big on accountability. Hundreds of millions of dollars in Minnesota have been squandered or fraudulently stolen. Education performance has never been worse. Inflation-wise, gas, groceries, and energy and housing costs in Minnesota have skyrocketed. In terms of education, we're no longer one of the top tier education states. We're now competing to try to stay in the middle at least a little bit. The rule of law has been forfeited in the sense that the police have been undercut. Tim Walz has been friendly with those who talk about defunding the police, and we paid a deep price. But I think the other thing that's interesting is the blame game. Tim Walz, when he didn't call the National Guard in to help stop the rioting in May of 2020, it wasn't his fault. It was because the National Guard was comprised of a bunch of 19-year-old cooks. When the streets continued to burn, it wasn't his fault. It was Mayor Jacob Fry's fault. When it came to his executive orders that backfired, it wasn't his fault. It was that someone did something wrong, and he would, if you will, walk it back without owning it. So I think from my perspective, Tim Walz has a weird capability to sidestep culpability.
We've been making the point here and on the radio that Tim Walz has been making Minnesota more like California, right? Sanctuary city for illegals, all this transgender stuff, tampons and bathrooms, like bathrooms for kids, like crazy, weird stuff. But when I'm thinking of California, Gavin Newsom has a similar ability where something terrible happens and there's no accountability. Now, do you account to that the media in California with Newsom or Minnesota with Walz, the media and their lack of holding him accountable? Or is there something special about Tim Walz that he's so skilled or conniving or whatever that he's able to get around tough accountability?
No, I think this one definitely has to go to the media. The media has let Tim Walz skate free over and over again. The national media this time around is going to be far more investigative. And I think Tim Walz is going to find it uncomfortable because he has been getting a free ride. And I don't think the national media will allow that.
Yeah, that's right. Let's hope. What about his affability? I'm trying to think of why Kamala would choose him. And I think it's to counter the J.D. Vance Midwest thing, right? And he has this kind of like folksy shtick thing that he does. What have you noticed knowing him so intimately on the campaign trail?
Well, he's friendly and he does well that way. And I don't think Kamala Harris has to worry about Tim Walz upstaging her. He's going to play second fiddle. He knows the rules. He knows the game. I think he's thrilled to be on this stage. I think that both Kamala Harris and Tim Walz can talk for several minutes and not say much. I mean, Kamala Harris can make a speech out of the word unburdened. Tim Walz can make a word salad out of a crisis issue such as kids' education and dismiss the entire affair by saying, well, kids really haven't missed much school. He had a famous quote in 2022 saying 80% of the kids in Minnesota missed less than 10 days of school during COVID pandemic, when the fact was most kids in Minnesota missed a full year of school. So I think from that perspective, Kamala and Tim are similar. They can go on and say very little. And in that regard, it's not threatening.
Last question for you. We had a caller on the radio from Minnesota talk about Walz's comment during the campaign that, oh, those people out, what do they call it, outstate in the country, that's just where there's just rocks and cows out there. What do you make of that comment?
Tim Walz makes it sound like he's the friend of the farmer, the everyday person, the greater Minnesota person, that he's going to be able to woo that vote. An awful lot of people don't realize that when I ran against him in 2022, we beat him in his own district. In Congressional District 1, the southern part of Minnesota, he won that 6 times in Congress. He won it the first time he ran for governor. We beat him by 8 points in that area. The people that knew him best wanted him least. He called them rocks and cows because they dared to disagree with him. There's no question when Tim Walz is backed into a corner, he will come out with some of these words that just aren't fair. He doesn't want to be called names, but he'll call other people's names. But the bottom line is the people who knew Tim Walz best said no thank you to a second term for a governor. But unfortunately, Minneapolis and St. Paul carried the day predominantly.
Dr. Scott Jensen ran against him in 2022. Dr. Jensen, I hope Kamala and Walz lose and you can run against Walz again and win that governorship. back, sir.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Scott Jensen, thank you very much for your time. Coming up next, let's do a little investigation, a little deeper dive into this stolen valor claim about Tim Walz. Do that next, right here on the First TV.
I would say those first days, when there were riots, I could smell the burning tires. And that was a very real thing. And I kept the windows open for as long as I could because I felt like that was such a touchstone of what was happening.
Wow, that is so bizarre. That's the First Lady. That's Tim Walz's wife. Listen, there's no one better to talk to. We have great guests today. Just talked to the guy who ran against him in the last governor's race, Dr. Scott Jensen. Now we're going to go to Hank Long, who's a journalist at Alpha News, which specializes in Minnesota politics and has been covering Walz for a long time. We were just talking to Scott Jensen, who said that Minnesota media has had a light touch on Walz for a long time. Well, that's where Alpha News comes in. They are not. Hank, great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today to help you guys understand a little bit more about this new national politician.
Yeah, right.
So,
well, we need to. What is Minnesota saying right now about their governor being the VP pick?
Well, that depends on who you're reading and who you're paying attention to. Like I said, I work for Alpha News and cover legislative issues and state political issues. The flagship newspaper in Minnesota is the Star Tribune. I don't know if you can see the headline. The Star Tribune happens to be run by a former confidant and cabinet member of Walz's administration. His name's Steve Grove, and he was hired in 2023 to take over leadership of the Star Tribune. And he was hired directly from Walz's cabinet. So if you want to know about politics in Minnesota and you're reading a newspaper like the Star Tribune, you're going to get a very biased interpretation of what's been happening.
Wow,
but
amazing.
I would say
that's
Minnesotans,
straight propaganda from the administration.
Yeah, Minnesotans who have lived here for a long time understand their media, and some of them will just gravitate to it depending on their political paradigm. But at Alpha News, it's an organization that has really grounded itself in filling a void in the media landscape in Minnesota, and we've attracted a large audience of people that have been kind of fed up with false narratives. And over the last 2.5 years, it's been more than that, 4 years, dating back to the George Floyd riots and the COVID lockdowns that Tim Walz governed over. There has been a lot of outcry from Minnesotans wanting to know the truth. So people like myself working for Alpha News, Liz Collin, and many other great colleagues have really worked hard to help people understand the record and the quote unquote political evolution of Tim Walz. So it's been a busy week.
What are the most important things you think we need to know about Tim Walz?
Number one, he's a true Marxist leaning politician that I think dating back to his early years in Congress, he first ran for Congress in 2006, and he claimed to be a moderate. He was running in southern Minnesota. Mankato is the town that he had lived in and taught in since 1997 or so. And he claimed to be a veteran. He was a veteran for Kerry back in 2006. So he was always quite a liberal, but was like, I like guns. I like my small towns and things like this. Well, that quickly evolved over his career in Congress. And by the time he ran for governor in 2018, everyone who understood politics in Minnesota knew this guy was very far left in his policies and his rhetoric. And a lot of the narratives you'll see on the national level, especially that were kind of portrayed at his acceptance rally last night with Vice President Harris, are he's the coach, he's the teacher, he's neighborly. It's kind of a facade when you get to know this individual. He's very far left, and he's vindictive in a lot of his rhetoric when people are challenging his narratives. So,
give me some examples, because you're right. That is the framing, that he's like this down-home Midwest country guy,
Yeah.
wears the camouflage hat and hunts and all this, and he's the coach, right? What's the truth?
Well, the truth is Walz has been governor in Minnesota since 2018. In 2022, the Democrats in Minnesota at the legislative level were able to capture control of both the House and the Senate at the state level of politics. And so that gave Democrats under Walz's leadership what we call a trifecta, right? Complete control of government. And that's when I believe Tim Walz revealed his true self. In just the last two legislative sessions, Minnesota has seen its state budget increase by 40% in just the last 2 years. It was an unprecedented, historic budget increase. We've seen far-reaching legislation on abortion access. Obviously, that's the fallout from the Hobbs decision in 2022. And Tim Walz will say this is a sanctuary state. This is a place for people who are seeking abortions to get the dignity and the care they're seeking. He did have an appearance with Vice President Kamala Harris in March of this year at an abortion clinic, a pretty well-known abortion clinic in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he really pumped that up here in the local media, and then in the last few weeks as the most historic visit. A vice president or president had never visited an abortion clinic before, and he was honored that Vice President Harris would tour an abortion clinic with him. And he talked about how Minnesota is a beacon for people across the country who are looking for greater access to abortion. Now, pro-life groups and just reasonable advocacy groups have said that Minnesota right now has the most far-left abortion legislation in the United States of America. So he whether it's taxing and spending on unprecedented levels, really reaching for the brass ring when it comes to a lot of these social and policy issues, Tim Walz has revealed himself in the last 2 years to be a governor that is not anything close to a moderate. He's about as far left as anyone in my state has ever seen. I grew up here. Tim Walz grew up in Nebraska. He's not from Minnesota. He likes to pretend he is from here. He's lived here for, 30 years technically, but he spent 12 of those years in Congress. And he's lived in the governor's mansion for the last 6 years. So a lot of people don't really think that the down-home Tim Walz connects with the folks that have been born and raised here.
That's right. Tell us, maybe we only got about 2 minutes. We can spend some time with the next guest about his reaction during George Floyd. I want to ask you to give us some down and dirty on what happened with the fraud. There's a couple different fraud cases in Minnesota underneath his reign, but tell us the big COVID one.
Yeah, well, I mean, the COVID fraud is really what it comes down to is there was a series of emails that a number of attorneys and journalists uncovered during the pandemic of quite a few exchanges between Walz and his health commissioners, various members of his cabinet, and then public relations strategists that were trying to help his administration develop narratives to keep people locked down, to keep sports shut down for youth, schools locked down. And there was two periods during 2020 and 2021 where Walz, I guess, squeezed the most that he could out of his emergency powers that he had been prescribed by state statute. And Alpha News and others had uncovered through these emails that the numbers that the administration was referring to when it came to COVID spread and the narratives that they were telling us about how young people playing hockey in hockey rinks or playing out on baseball fields outside were somehow causing older people in long-term health care facilities to contract COVID were completely concocted. And we have emails to prove it that are public now, where these officials in the healthcare administrative state has said, we don't have numbers. We need to be able to help tie youth sports and people gathering to people getting sick in nursing homes, and we need to do it now. And I mean, the record is out there. The emails are public. There were legislative hearings on this.
Let me just cut you off here because we only got about a minute. And this is great. This is a great point about Tim Walz. When I said COVID fraud, that's not even the story I was referring to. I was referring to the feeding the children COVID fraud.
Oh, yes.
But it's great that all I have to do is say COVID fraud, and it's like multiple stories.
Yeah, you're talking about the actual Feeding Our Future related, that's what it's called. It's an organization called Feeding Our Future. And during COVID, there was a federal program where money was filtered down from the federal government, and states were able to allocate it to all sorts of organizations that would be feeding kids while they were not in school. And there were a number of organizations, and the biggest one was Feeding Our Future, that was based in Minnesota, claimed to feed thousands and thousands and thousands of kids meals that they weren't getting because they weren't in school, right? Because Walz had shut down school. And lo and behold, almost every one of these reports of feeding kids were concocted and false. And people were allowed to do this for 18 months before anyone in state government, including Walz himself and the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, ever, quote unquote, caught them red-handed. $250 million of fraud.
Yeah. 18 months, $250 million. Amazing. Hank Long, incredibly important in this whole conversation, of course. Alpha News, which is where, if you live in Minnesota, certainly you need to go to get the true story of what's happening in that wonderful state. What's the website, Hank?
Yeah, it's alphanews.org. Pretty easy.
Beautiful. Hey, man, keep up the great work, and let's spread the word. And if people are like, oh, that's just the vice president. No. This is how Kamala Harris would have governed if she's ever been governor. And this is how they will govern if they ever get the White House. Coming up next, we'll spend more time on Walz and what happened in the George Floyd aftermath. That's with our last guest next, right here on the First TV.
How was last night?
Scary. I live in the high-rise right back here, and I'd seen them as they came down Lake Street. But then they turned and started coming over here, and I'm sitting out looking out my window. And they went straight to Office Max, the dollar store, and every store over here that I go to. I have nowhere to go now. I have no way to get there because the buses aren't running. These people did this for no reason. It's not going to bring George back here. George is in a better place than we are. And last night, I'm going to be honest, I wish I was where George was because this is ridiculous. These people are tearing up our livelihood.
It's heartbreaking. Who did these George Floyd riots hurt the most? Dustin Greggy is here. He's a Minnesota Republican strategist. Dustin shared that clip on his Twitter, which is Greggy Dustin, Grage Dustin. Dustin, I'm grateful you're here, and you know all things about Tim Walz. We've talked about a lot today so far, but if you don't mind, I'd like to focus on George Floyd. What is your assessment on his reaction to the George Floyd riots?
I mean, just quite frankly, it was just completely inadequate and inferior of a response that we should have seen. If this was a Republican governor, it would have been a far different response. I like to pick on my favorite governor in this country, like most Republicans, that'd be Ron DeSantis. But what's the state that didn't have any of these riots, that didn't have any of these issues, burning buildings, ravaged communities? None of this happened in the state of Florida. But in Minnesota, it's just a very different story because the radical left here just runs the show, quite frankly. And if you go back to Tim Walz's record in Congress, he perceived himself as a moderate when he was in the 1st Congressional District of Minnesota. And he legislated pretty fairly to that point until he had political aspirations that were higher. And of course, at that point, he was once an NRA A-rated member. Now he's F-rated, and he's backed by David Hogg in his bid to become vice president of the United States. So the largest gun activist against the Second Amendment, he does a complete 180. I like to call him a political chameleon because he will just match the background of whatever means necessary in order to climb the political ladder. A ladder climbing Larry, we'll call him, I guess. But in the instance of George Floyd and those riots, just completely inadequate. And there's really no other way to mince words about it. And I believe Stephanie's the name of the woman in that video. I've never met Stephanie personally, but I actually know her pastor. And here in Wright County, we share a border with Hennepin in Minneapolis. this is the most conservative county in the state of Minnesota. They are the most liberal, and just a river separates the two of them, which is dramatic. But you can also just tell between the responses. In this county, where we have conservative leadership, our sheriff was already ready. We had one of the larger strip malls in the state of Minnesota. He already had a dozen patrolmen right in that parking lot on the county line, ready to roll if the protesters crossed that river line. In Hennepin County, it just wasn't the case. And they weren't prepared for any of it. And quite frankly, I would say they encouraged it. They encouraged this violence because it was political. There was a political election in 2020, and they needed to actually create chaos, quite frankly. And you can see it in the members that they elected. Rep. John Thompson's a great example, where he actually went to the front steps of the home of the Minneapolis union representative in Hugo, Minnesota, and he called them racist white people, and that they were talking to the Klansmen of Minnesota right there on his front porch in front of his family and friends and neighbors, threatening to burn down Hugo, Minnesota on the suburbs. These are just, quite frankly, radical people. And Tim Walz endorsed that man, by the way, Representative John Thompson, who also had allegations of beating his wife at the time. They're just very radical people. And the Democrat Socialists of America here in Minneapolis, they're radical, and they encouraged all of this. And to this day, me and my wife just pulled up into Minneapolis this last week to go meet some family, and the businesses are still boarded up. It's been 4 years, and they're still boarded up to this day. There's just no excuse for any of it, and I remember it very vividly. George Floyd actually died on my birthday, May 25th. Remember it very vividly. Me and my wife and our newborn child went to go see a waterfall just a little bit south of Minneapolis at the time, and I got the notification on my phone, and I saw the video, and I said, this isn't going to be good. And I lived through a handful of these situations with MPD, and, you know, sometimes they're in the wrong, sometimes they're in the right. And in this case, I just knew, regardless of the facts, this was going to be bad. And sure enough, for 4 consecutive nights, Minneapolis burned. And there's just no excuse for it. I had family that were a part of that National Guard response who served overseas. And quite frankly, they weren't that impressed with the response. And even to the point where individuals within the Walz administration, I won't say specific names, just to keep them a little bit on the safer side, not blow them up completely. They were coordinating with DSA and the Democratic Socialists of America and Antifa on when the National Guard would actually deploy. So they were coordinating at this point. And a documentary I recommend all your viewers to watch actually is The Fall of Minneapolis. The individual, Rep. John Thompson, where he went to the door of the union rep for MPD, his wife actually hosts that documentary and goes into deep detail on everything regarding the riots. And it's just saddening. I mean, 4 years later, we're still in this situation. George Floyd Square is still closed off.
Tell me, I want to make sure I get this right. What was it about the border? You said there were like police lined up on one side of the county line. Was that what you're saying?
Yeah, Wright County, Minnesota. So our sheriff, Sean Derringer, he's one of the higher reps in the Sheriff's Association here in the state of Minnesota. Very highly educated, very conservative, constitutionalist sheriff, was ready to go. We here in Wright County, we value law enforcement, and our law enforcement values our public safety. So there was already sheriff deputies all across that line, ready to go. We have the largest patrol division in the state of Minnesota, despite only being closer to 10 in actual population. We have the largest patrol division, and that's just conservative leadership. That's the difference between protecting your citizens and not. And Hennepin County has 3 of the largest police agencies in the state of Minnesota, and absolutely no response at all. And whether that be blamed more on the mayor or the Tim Walz, the governor, they share a little bit of that blame, but ultimately the buck stops with the governor of Minnesota. He had access to the National Guard, and he had access to the State Patrol and did nothing about it.
Amazing. I got about 2 minutes. Tell me about George Floyd Square.
Yeah, so George Floyd Square, I probably visited there 6 times now. I haven't gone back in about 1.5 years now to this point. And for a while, it was fairly, I would say, safe, as long as you were friendly with the locals. But then one other time when we were shooting a video for a candidate in George Floyd Square, one of the cashiers of Cup Foods, not Cub, Cup Foods, came out screaming at a young child, accusing them of stealing. And then the father of that child came up and approached the clerk owner, and they started getting in a physical altercation. And of course, no police response because it's a closed off designated area where law enforcement is not welcome. At one point for a consecutive amount of years, emergency services wouldn't be willing to cross into the designated zone because they feared for their lives. People would have to have bloody bodies pulled out of the designated square in order to receive emergency services. And that's how wild it has gone to this point. Now it's softened quite a bit. You can drive through it now, but everything still remains, and it's still a massive danger zone for people. And to this day, we're still seeing the effects of Tim Walz's leadership here in Minnesota. And quite frankly, I hope the national scale does not allow him to get away with his radical record, because quite frankly, he's Gavin Newsom, but worse, just with less hair, and he wears a lot more flannel.
Dustin Greggy, please follow him on Twitter. I don't know if there's anyone better that has all the background than Dustin, Grage, Dustin on Twitter. Dustin, great to talk to you, man. Thank you for all your work.
No, I appreciate it. Otherwise, have a good one. We'll chat later.
Yeah, man. Keep it up. Just what a pick. What a pick from Kamala Harris. And all this opposition research was out there. None of this is new. It's been around for years. Now we just have an excuse to talk about it. The fact that she would go with him. Listen, if that doesn't fire you up, conservatives, to make sure that these people get nowhere near Washington, D.C., I don't know what would at this point. Mike Slater, The First TV. Spread the word.